The air in the oversight chamber wasn't merely thick. It was a pressurized vault, each molecule humming with an unspoken tension. Outside, the Capitol buzzed with the usual political static, but within these hallowed walls, a different kind of current flowed. This wasn't just another televised hearing, this was a crucible, a stage set for a clash that would rip through the veneer of Washington decorum and expose the raw, bleeding heart of a nation. 62 million hearts, perhaps more, were already skipping beats across America, unknowingly bracing for the 11 words that would soon detonate like shrapnel across a live congressional feed. First, he entered. Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Defense, moved with the measured arrogance of a man accustomed to owning every room he entered. His navy suit, a second skin of power, seemed stitched from the very fabric of authority. His shoulders squared like a general surveying conquered territory. He didn't shake hands, he scanned, his eyes sharp and predatory, finding the nearest camera lens with practiced ease. A slight, almost imperceptible smirk played on his lips, a silent declaration, a wordless assertion, "I run this." He dropped into his chair, leaning back as if it were a throne, fingers interlocked, jaw set firm. He looked not like a man preparing to defend, but one poised to dismiss, to obliterate. Then the door opened again. Jasmine Crockett. She entered without a sound, her stride unbroken, her gaze unwavering. There was no entourage, no frantic rustle of papers, just a slim, unassuming folder clutched in her hand. Her silence was so complete, so profound, it made the cavernous chamber feel suddenly too small, too loud with its own suppressed breaths. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had already won a battle the world hadn't yet witnessed. Across from Pete, she settled into her seat with perfect posture, calm, controlled. Her fingers rested lightly on the closed folder, a seemingly innocuous object that, in that moment, pulsed with the latent power of a sheathed sword. Pete didn't look away. His smirk widened, a challenge. Jasmine didn't blink. The chairman, a stoic figure, adjusted his microphone. "This hearing is now in session." The words hung in the air, a formal pronouncement that felt utterly inadequate for the storm brewing. No one moved. Not the aides, not the press, not even the millions of viewers at home, glued to their screens, because everyone watching knew this wasn't merely a budget dispute. This was a reckoning. Jasmine began to flip through her documents, the soft rustle of paper amplified in the sudden, expectant quiet. Pete leaned slightly forward, his voice a low growl, barely audible to the microphones, but cutting directly to her. "You look calm," he muttered, the words dripping with condescension, "but that won't last." She didn't turn her head. She didn't respond. Her hand, however, paused for the briefest of moments on the folder's edge. The camera zoomed in, a silent witness. Something shifted in the air, a palpable change in pressure. No words had been spoken aloud in reply, yet everyone felt it. The match had been struck, and the oxygen in the room was already burning. Pete relaxed back into his chair, a man who believed he had tossed the first grenade and planned to walk through the smoke unscathed. Jasmine slowly clasped her hands, and in that thick, suffocating silence, a question roared, unspoken but deafening. What had Pete Hegseth just said, and how far was Jasmine Crockett willing to answer it? The hearing room didn't fall quiet. It fell dead. Reporters froze mid-keystroke. A Capitol staffer dropped her phone, and even the chairman looked as if he'd forgotten how to breathe. Pete Hegseth's words, "Your skin might be in Congress, but your blood ain't American," had not merely landed, they had detonated, leaving behind a vacuum of stunned disbelief. In the eye of this silent, calcified storm, Jasmine Crockett sat utterly still, her hands resting on the folder, her eyes locked on Pete like she was watching a man light the fuse to his own coffin. America, watching in real time, realized they had just witnessed something they couldn't unhear. The question now wasn't whether Jasmine would respond. It was how far she was about to go. Time itself seemed to pause, stretched taut between Pete Hegseth's venomous utterance and Jasmine Crockett's profound stillness. CNN's live feed dropped its ambient music. MSNBC cut to a wide shot. Even Fox paused its ticker, as if unsure whether to lean in or pull out. On every screen across the nation, the moment stretched just past comfort and into history. Jasmine didn't respond with a word. She didn't need to. With the same controlled precision one might use to light a fuse underwater, slow, exact, knowing what it would cost, she reached into her leather bag. She pulled out a single photograph. Black and white, worn, folded in half once, then twice. It was the kind of thing that didn't live in picture frames, but in glove compartments, in Bibles, in war chests long buried. She laid it face up on the desk, directly between herself and Pete. The man in the faded image stood at attention on a foreign shore, rifle slung over his shoulder, boots caked in sand. His uniform was pressed, his smile tight but steady. There was no caption, no need. The truth was in the silence of the picture. My grandfather's name was Clarence Crockett, U.S. Army 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion. He landed at Utah Beach on D-Day, 1944, and never came home. Pete didn't blink, but the line of his jaw hardened, a subtle clenching that betrayed the first flicker of unease. Jasmine continued, not because she needed to defend herself, but because the country needed to remember. He died saving 3 men. None of them looked like him. 2 of them wrote letters to my grandmother. The government never did. All she received was a folded flag and an address to a cemetery in Normandy. Her eyes, still unwavering, met Pete's. That was the bloodline you just questioned. The room remained frozen. Reporters gripped their pens tighter. Staffers shifted their weight but didn't dare breathe. The sound in the chamber was not silence, it was pressure. Jasmine wasn't shouting. She wasn't pleading. She was testifying, not for her, but for him. She turned the photo slowly, placing it toward Pete, the old soldier staring up at him through faded decades. You said my skin might be in Congress, but my blood isn't American? She said, her voice dropping to a low, cutting whisper. You were wrong. That beach drank my family's blood long before your name ever made it onto a ballot. Pete didn't reach for the photo. He didn't look away either. Jasmine folded her hands again. The photo stayed in place. So did the air. Then she reached down beside her chair, not rushed, not theatrical, and lifted a small worn case wrapped in faded velvet. She didn't explain what it was. She didn't need to. By the time she placed it on the table and unlatched the clasp, everyone in the chamber knew what was inside. A folded American flag, triangle-shaped, its edges soft with age. Red and white stripes tucked beneath navy blue and white stars, pressed perfectly into a symbol of honor. But as Jasmine opened the lid, no one felt pride. They felt weight. This, she said, her voice evened and low, is all my grandmother received. No funeral, no body, no ceremony, just this flag, shipped in a box smaller than the one used to deliver her husband's boots. No apology, no explanation, just a piece of fabric soaked in myth, not truth. The silence deepened, heavy with the untold stories of a nation's forgotten debt. The folded flag, a silent sentinel, lay on the polished oak between them. A piece of fabric soaked not in myth, but in the raw, unvarnished truth of sacrifice. Pete Hegseth stared at it, his face a mask of calculated indifference, but the tremor in his jaw betrayed the first cracks in his carefully constructed facade. Jasmine Crockett didn't look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the committee, the cameras, the country. She was finished with him, yes, but she wasn't finished. Not yet. The wound she'd opened wasn't merely symbolic, it was fiscal, a gaping chasm in the very budget Pete Hegseth was sworn to uphold. She leaned forward now, both hands resting on the slim folder she hadn't truly touched until this moment, and when she flipped it open, the quiet in the room didn't shatter, it braced. $78 million, she said, her voice clear, calm, and louder than before, not in volume, but in certainty. That's how much your department earmarked for minority veteran services last year. Health clinics, PTSD outreach, suicide prevention programs in underfunded districts. She turned page 1, holding it up for all to see. White paper, red lines, the government seal stark at the top. But that money, she continued, her eyes locking onto Pete's, never arrived. Not in Baltimore, not in St. Louis, not in South Dallas. Clinics were approved, budgets passed, veterans applied, and then nothing. Pete shifted, not nervously, not defensively, but like someone annoyed to be interrupted before dessert. "We made a necessary reallocation," he replied, his tone clipped. "Priority adjustments. National security evolves, needs change." She nodded once, slow. "And the need to fund communities of color," she asked, her voice a quiet blade. "Did that evolve, or did it just evaporate?" Pete didn't answer immediately. His mouth moved, but his eyes had drifted to the television monitor on the sidewall, the one now broadcasting his face split screen with Jasmine's. He was on camera, but she was in control. He cleared his throat. "Resources were redirected to operations with greater strategic visibility. We have threats on multiple fronts. China, cyber warfare. We had to." She cut him off, not with volume, but with proof. She lifted another sheet, this time a transaction summary authorized by his office, dated 6 weeks before the funding was scheduled to roll out. $32.4 million, Jasmine read aloud, her voice unwavering, transferred from the Veteran Equity Division to the Office of Strategic Messaging. For what exactly? Pete exhaled sharply. For communication strategy in battleground states, for recruitment, for image stability. She tilted her head, a gesture of quiet disdain. "You mean PR, public awareness," he corrected. "No," Jasmine said, the steel in her voice now unmistakable. "You stole care from the people who bled for this country to buy ads convincing the rest of us that you still care." He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Behind them, someone in the gallery muttered, "Damn." Jasmine didn't even look up. She slid the entire folder across the table until it touched Pete's side. All itemized, all time-stamped, and all publicly traceable. "I did your job for you, Mr. Secretary." Pete didn't touch the folder, but his fingers tensed just slightly above the table. Jasmine leaned back, the edge of a storm still in her voice. $78 million didn't disappear. It was hijacked. And it didn't vanish into national defense. It vanished into your message machine. The numbers were no longer numbers, they were blood, with receipts, and Jasmine Crockett had just made sure the whole country saw the invoice. The folder sat unopened in front of Pete, but Jasmine wasn't waiting for him to reach for it. She had already turned the page, literally and figuratively. What came next didn't require interpretation theory or debate. It was printed in black ink on government letterhead with a signature that matched the nameplate in front of him. She slid the next document across the table, slower this time, like a blade being unsheathed in full view. It was a memo, dated, stamped, official, and at the bottom, scrawled in pen with unambiguous clarity, Peter Hegseth. "This is your internal communications directive, sent to the Office of Strategic Messaging, October 3rd. 1 month before the first clinic funding was quietly pulled." Pete stared at it. She watched him. The camera zoomed. Jasmine didn't blink. She read it aloud, not dramatically, but surgically, word for word, line by line. "Minority outreach shows low ROI." Her voice didn't rise, but the oxygen in the room dropped. "Prioritize veteran image campaigns in battleground regions. Focus on controllable narratives." She looked up. "You didn't just reallocate funds, Mr. Secretary. You reduced my community to a marketing calculation." Pete's face tightened, not with guilt, but with calculation. He looked to the chairman, then back to Jasmine. "That was an internal planning note," he said. "Not a directive, not a policy. Internal strategy doesn't equate to execution." "But the funding was pulled," she said. "The ads went live, the outreach dried up. And this," she tapped the memo with her fingertip, "this is the bridge between action and intention." Pete leaned forward, jaw tight. "It's not that simple." "It's exactly that simple," she replied. "You saw a group of veterans who didn't benefit your narrative and you starved them out of your budget. Then you spent that money crafting stories for swing states so you could look like a hero while people like Sergeant Malik Thomas died waiting for an appointment." Pete started to speak, but Jasmine cut in, sharper now. "Do you remember his name? You should. He called your office 4 times, left 3 voicemails. His daughter held his discharge papers while he bled out in a waiting room." That silence returned, not stunned this time, but seething. Jasmine leaned in, the memo still resting untouched in front of Pete. "You signed this, you own this, and today the country saw it without your permission." Pete didn't answer. His lawyer behind him scribbled something and slid a note forward. He didn't read it because there wasn't a legal defense for what had just landed on national television. There was only truth in print, in signature, in blood. And Jasmine Crockett had just made sure the whole country saw the invoice.
The memo still lay between them like a smoking gun, undeniable, irrefutable. The voice of Sergeant Malik Thomas, a ghost given sound, still echoed in the memory of the room, a raw testament to a system that had stolen care and called it strategy. The committee chamber hadn't recovered, not from the flag, not from the memo, not from the whistleblower, nor from the agonizing testimonies. But Jasmine wasn't about to offer mercy. This wasn't a debate anymore. It was exposure, a surgical dissection of a man's character and a nation's conscience. Pete Hegseth had been sitting in silence for too long. He could feel the weight of that folded flag searing through the polished oak of the desk, a silent accusation. His jaw twitched, his knuckles pale against the microphone base. Every headline, every viral clip, every quiet cutting word from Jasmine had turned him from commentator to condemned. He'd watched his wife wipe away silent tears in the gallery. He'd seen the phones lifted, recording every breath he didn't know how to control. And now, with nothing left to defend and nowhere left to hide behind, he did the only thing a man drowning in guilt sometimes does. He exploded. "You're just a race-baiting loudmouth," Pete roared, slamming a hand on the desk so hard the microphone bounced. The words ripped through the room like a crack of thunder, shattering the fragile, reverent silence. Gasps burst from the gallery. Even the chairman's gavel froze mid-air, a silent plea for order. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even blink. She simply rose to her feet, slowly, calmly, and with the weight of a century behind her bones. She didn't look at Pete. She looked at America. Her voice came out as a whisper, but it carried farther than any shout. "The louder I get, the more you remember who you tried to silence." Pete's mouth hung open, still breathing heavy, chest puffed like a man who had just thrown his last grenade and realized it was a boomerang. His outburst echoed on live streams, now blaring across CNN, MSNBC, and C-SPAN feeds. Clips already clipped, tweets already scheduled, but the camera stayed locked on Jasmine. She didn't look victorious, she looked certain. "You think this is noise?" she said, finally facing Pete. "This is survival. This is what it sounds like when truth has been ignored long enough to grow teeth." No one moved. Even the stenographer's hands, still poised above the keys, forgot to type for a moment. And then Jasmine leaned forward, not in aggression, but in gravity. "You called me loud, But you heard the tape. That wasn't my voice. That was Malik's. That was Lenny's. That was every American who loved this country enough to bleed for it and got nothing but a wait list in return." Pete tried to speak again. The words caught. Something in him knew the cameras had just caught the truth, not in what Jasmine said, but in how little he had left to say. Then the chairman cleared his throat, breaking the tension just enough to remind the room it was still part of Congress. Barely. But the moment had already slipped out of the building. Across America, the clip of Jasmine's whisper was already flooding through phones, newsrooms, veterans groups, and living rooms. Because while Pete's shout had echoed, it was Jasmine's stillness that detonated. As Jasmine lowered herself back into her chair, shoulders composed, gaze steady, it was Representative Jamie Raskin who leaned forward into his mic, breaking the stillness with a voice calm, clear, and surgical. "Mr. Chairman," he moved, "I move to censure Mr. Hegseth for conduct unbecoming a congressional witness and for violating the decorum of this body." The words hit like a quiet grenade. Pete blinked, not as a man caught off guard, but as a man who suddenly realized the winds had shifted. 2 days ago, he walked into this hearing certain he would dominate headlines with patriotic soundbites and performative fury. Now he was one sentence away from being stamped with the label disgraced. The chairman hesitated. His fingers tapped the wooden gavel like a warning bell. "Is there a second?" A Republican voice answered. "I second the motion," said Representative Brian Fitzpatrick, a moderate with a military background. The chamber turned toward him in disbelief. He didn't flinch. This isn't about partisanship, it's about dignity and the failure to uphold it. Gasps echoed softly like the collective intake of a nation watching its own fractures deepen. More murmurs stirred. A third voice, Democrat, a fourth, Independent. Then finally silence again. Not the frozen kind, the expectant kind, the kind that precedes thunder. Pete shifted in his seat, eyes darting. "This is a joke," he growled, loud enough for every microphone to catch. "You're going to censure me for defending the flag, for calling out a political stunt?" But no one replied, because by now, even his own defenders saw the unraveling wasn't caused by partisanship, but by pride. The chairman spoke next. "The motion is recognized. A vote will proceed." Pete stood up, hands clenched, voice shaking but defiant. "You want to censure me? Fine, do it. I'd rather be censured for telling the truth than applauded for playing a victim." Jasmine didn't rise. She didn't look at him. She didn't even need to. Because the gallery, the live stream, the press, all saw what she had done without yelling, without smearing, without folding. She had held up a mirror, and Pete had shattered his own reflection. The vote was swift, 22-9. The motion passed. Pete Hegseth, Fox contributor, former Army officer, now officially censured by Congress. And in that moment, history didn't cheer. It simply recorded. Because justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. And sometimes the whisper is a gavel. The gavel hadn't moved, but the verdict was already written in air. Pete Hegseth's face was stiff, jaw tight, fists resting like bricks on polished oak. He had roared, postured, played the patriot. But now he sat trapped in silence while the woman he tried to humiliate stood with no need to raise her voice. Jasmine didn't turn toward the chairman. She didn't even glance at the cameras. Her focus was fixed on Pete. Calm, grounded, devastating. And when she spoke, it didn't echo. It sank. "You didn't lose this hearing because of me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You lost it because your truth couldn't survive history." Pete's lips parted as if to protest, but no sound came. Jasmine stepped forward, not for drama, but for clarity. You thought this was terroritus in numbers, cut budgets, erase names? But we don't disappear, Mr. Hegseth. We resurface, we testify, and we remember. The room was still. Your version of America salutes itself in the mirror. Mine folds flags with trembling hands and leaves the last plate empty at dinner. Pete shifted in his seat. His eyes flicked toward the gallery, toward his wife who now couldn't meet his gaze. Jasmine said, "You mocked my skin, my grief. You called my truth theater. But if this was a show, then let history be the audience and let it decide who really stood for this country." She reached into her file one last time. Not a letter, not a memo, just a small weathered photo. Clarence Crockett in uniform, his eyes defiant, mouth solemn. She placed it gently on the desk between them. "I didn't come here for revenge," she said. "I came here to make sure that when you speak of service, you remember whose service made yours possible." Pete stood up slowly. No words, no outburst, just the heavy breath of someone who had finally realized that sometimes defeat doesn't come with headlines. It comes with silence that won't go away. He turned and walked out, past the flag, past the cameras, past the people who once cheered him. Jasmine didn't follow him with her eyes. She sat back down, folded her hands, and exhaled, not in relief, but in resolve. Because truth doesn't win in a single moment. It wins when it outlives the lies. And while Pete exited into the hallway shadows, Jasmine sat in the full glare of history's light.
History wasn't done with her yet. The wind in Normandy doesn't whisper. It remembers. It carries the weight of boys who never made it home, of letters half-written, of flags folded with trembling hands. As Jasmine Crockett stepped out of the hearing room, the world outside had already erupted. Not in outrage, but in memory. The name Clarence Crockett had become a drumbeat across the nation, surging to the top of every platform within the hour. It wasn't driven by bots or headlines. It was driven by veterans, men and women from every branch, every decade, every color, posting photos, medals, folded flags, and most of all, stories, the kind no one had asked for in years. One image showed a sepia-toned snapshot, a black soldier kneeling beside a jeep, bandaging the leg of a wounded white GI. The caption was simple: "He saved my grandfather in Normandy. Now I'll defend his granddaughter in Congress." Another showed a wheelchair-bound vet in New Mexico saluting his TV, tears streaming down his face. His tweet read, "I served with men like Clarence. I am men like Clarence, and Jasmine just gave us back our voice." Even conservative veterans, those who didn't vote like Jasmine, didn't pray like Jasmine, found themselves resharing her words, because her voice didn't sound like a politician, it sounded like a granddaughter. And America knows how to listen to family when it hurts. In Minnesota, a 92-year-old widow posted her husband's field journal. Inside was a single line written in '44, "Sergeant Crockett, drag me through the mud, save my leg, never asked for thanks." That line, never read aloud in his lifetime, was now recited on podcasts and newscasts like Scripture. Pete Hegseth, once the darling of military segments, was suddenly untagged from every post that mattered. His email box overflowed not with praise, but with receipts. Veterans asking why their hospitals still had mold, why their paperwork vanished, why they were called low ROI in a memo with his name on it. But Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't tweet. She didn't speak to the press. Someone else did, unexpectedly. That evening, Fox News anchor Emily Kessler, known for her sharp critiques of progressive figures, opened her segment with silence. Then, slowly, she lifted a folded flag onto the desk in front of her. "Tonight," she said, "I won't argue. I won't spin. I'll just say this. What Jasmine Crockett did in that room wasn't political. It was American. The clip cut across ideological lines like a scalpel. Veterans from both parties shared it. Commentators from CNN to OAN reposted it. And for the first time in years, the comment sections weren't at war. They were united in stillness. Jasmine visited the Texas cemetery where her grandfather had no headstone, just a dry patch of grass and an old family cross hammered into the soil. A few reporters caught the moment. Her kneeling, one hand on the earth, the other holding that same folded triangle of flag she'd shown the nation. And still, the stories poured in. A Native American Marine wrote, "I never knew someone like Crockett existed. Now I know we've always existed, just not in the history books." By sunset, the House Oversight Committee's inbox was crashing from volume. Congressional aides read aloud the messages flooding in. Investigate, fund minority veterans, honor the buried names. But Jasmine didn't read those aloud. She was too busy writing something else. A new bill, a new beginning. Because when a nation remembers its wounded, it has a chance, maybe its last, to heal something deeper than politics. And this time, it didn't start with applause. It started with the sound of the forgotten finally being heard. The next morning, before the cameras rolled and the murmurs returned to the chamber like breath to lungs, Jasmine Crockett arrived early. She didn't bring a new file, no fresh report, no damning quote or secret recording. She carried only one thing, wrapped in cloth, firm and silent as stone, a folded American flag. Not just any flag, the one handed to her grandmother 76 years ago on a porch with no audience and no apology. The one that had rested in silence in a glass box for 3 generations. Today, it came out of mourning and into testimony. When the hearing resumed, Pete Hegseth was already seated, chin lowered, his confidence chipped from 1,000 cuts that no spin could bandage. The chairman called the session to order. Voices settled, and all eyes turned to Jasmine as she stood with that triangle of stars in her hands, pressed tight, reverent, but heavy. She didn't speak at first. She walked. Each step echoed in the chamber like a slow, methodical drumbeat. She stopped in front of Pete's table, not to confront, not to threaten, but to deliver something no statistic could match. Without a word, she laid the flag on the table in front of him, right where his hands could see it, right where the cameras could not look away. Pete didn't move, didn't blink. His fingers twitched, but he couldn't meet her eyes. "This," Jasmine finally said, her voice low but resonant. "This is the flag that covered Clarence Crockett's casket. It never made it to Arlington. It was folded by a neighbor, not a nation, because some sacrifices weren't deemed camera-worthy." Her gaze didn't harden. It softened, because truth doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just stands still and waits to be heard. This flag is not a prop. It's not for brandishing in ads or folding over your talking points. It's the last thing my family got when America was done with us. And now I'm returning it, not to shame you, but to show you. Pete's jaw clenched. One hand shifted as if to reach for the flag, but he stopped because he knew what it meant. Touching it meant acknowledgement, and acknowledgement meant collapse. The gallery was silent. Even reporters stopped typing. Jasmine didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked back to her seat, leaving the flag where it lay, right in front of the man who once said her blood wasn't American. The chairman cleared his throat, but even he knew not to break the moment. There are silences that indict louder than words. And there, under the fluorescence of C-SPAN and the scrutiny of a fractured nation, one man sat paralyzed by a triangle of folded cloth that weighed more than all his medals combined. Outside, the image hit the news within seconds. The flag trended globally, because sometimes the most powerful rebuttal isn't a speech. It's giving back what was stolen and daring the thief to carry its weight. The cameras had started to catch their breath. The public had begun to believe the crescendo had passed, but Jasmine hadn't sat down to rest. She had one more thread to pull, and this one came from the other side of the ocean, sealed in time, buried like a secret the country didn't know it still owed. She opened a manila envelope slowly, carefully, as if she were handling a relic. Inside was a single creased sheet of paper, Hand-signed, handwritten, its edges yellowed but preserved, like scripture. At the top, a Department of Defense letterhead. At the bottom, a signature from a Major Charles G. Rusk, now long dead. I received it from his grandson, Jasmine said, lifting the letter slightly, but keeping her voice low enough that it cut deeper than if she'd raised it. To whom it may concern, Private Clarence Crockett of the 761st Tank Battalion shielded my father, Lieutenant Harold Rusk, during mortar fire near Argentone. My father was wounded and unconscious. Crockett dragged him through 300 yards of open field, alone, under fire. He took 2 bullets to the back doing so. He survived. So did my father. We never forgot Clarence. We just never said it. The words didn't just land, they reverberated. Jasmine looked up, her voice tighter now. The letter was written in 1946. It was never mailed. It stayed locked in a drawer until last week, when the Rusk family saw what happened in this chamber and decided silence could no longer be their inheritance. She stepped forward, unfolded a second sheet. This is a notarized statement from the grandson authorizing it to enter the congressional record. I'm doing so now. Pete sat motionless, a monument to undoing. His hand was still inches from the folded flag, the letter now sitting like a spotlight between him and the truth he tried to erase. But Jasmine didn't look at him this time. She looked at the American people, the millions watching, not for entertainment, but for reckoning. This isn't just my story, or my grandfather's. This is what happens when our heroes die twice. Once in war, and once in the silence that follows. The chairman nodded, his gavel still untouched. A few members bowed their heads, others just stared. But as Jasmine sat down, one final question twisted in the air like a fuse, because Pete hadn't spoken, and a man that quiet usually means he's about to try something loud. The hearing room was quiet now. The buzz had faded, the lights had dimmed, the chairs were cold again. But in Jasmine's inbox, amid policy memos, clipped headlines, and donor messages, was one email that didn't feel like noise. It was from a young veteran in Detroit, 28, black, former Army medic. Subject line, for Clarence. She opened it without hesitation. You made us visible again, not just on TV, in memory, in history, in the mirror. She didn't cry. She had done that already, in private, where legacy stings deepest. But her hand lingered on the screen. The words weren't long. They didn't need to be. The Capitol was still. Somewhere behind her, workers wheeled away the cameras, the microphones unplugged. The headlines would scroll for one more day before new storms arrived.